A recording began to play in the studio and Julia Roberts' famous smile disappeared in seconds. Jimmy Fallon had been laughing. That big, genuine laugh that made millions of viewers feel like they were hanging out with a friend. Julia Roberts was in the middle of a story. Something funny about her kids, the kind of warm anecdote that had the audience charmed. She was radiant, gesturing with her hands, that legendary smile lighting up Studio 6B. Everything was perfect. Everything was going exactly as planned. And then Jimmy's producer spoke into his earpiece. "Jimmy, we have something. The recording. Should we play it now?" Jimmy's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He touched his ear, listening, then looked at Julia with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Julia," Jimmy said, his voice suddenly different, softer, more careful. "There's something I need to play for you. We weren't sure if we should, but someone very important asked us to." Julia's smile dimmed slightly. "What do you mean?" Jimmy reached toward a small device on his desk, a tablet connected to the studio's sound system. His finger hovered over the play button. "Just listen," he said quietly. He pressed play. Static crackled through the studio's speakers. Then a voice, a woman's voice, older, warm, with a slight southern accent that carried the weight of years and love. "Julia, sweetheart, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone." Julia Roberts' entire body went rigid. Her hands flew to her mouth. The smile, that famous $1 million smile that had graced 1,000 movie posters, vanished completely. The audience gasped. Questlove lowered his drumsticks. Jimmy sat frozen behind his desk, his hands still on the device, watching Julia's face transform with grief. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The voice continued from the speakers, filling the silent studio with words that had been recorded in secret, saved for this exact moment. "I want you to know how proud I am of you, how proud I've always been. From the day you were born, I knew you were something special. And watching you become the woman you are, Julia. That's been my greatest joy." Julia's hands were shaking. Tears streamed down her face, mascara beginning to streak. She wasn't trying to stop crying. She wasn't trying to compose herself. The actress who had performed in front of cameras for 3 decades had completely forgotten the cameras existed. "That's my grandmother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That's Jimmy. How did you?" Jimmy's own eyes were glistening. "Keep listening," he said gently. "To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 12 years earlier." Julia Roberts wasn't always Julia Roberts, global superstar and Oscar-winning actress. Well, by 2012, she was. But even Mies stars have people who remember them as just Julia. Just the girl who used to put on shows in her grandmother's living room. Betty Lewis was Julia's maternal grandmother. She'd raised Julia's mother, had been there for Julia's childhood, had been the steady presence through Julia's meteoric rise to fame. While Hollywood tried to change Julia, tried to mold her into something else, Betty Lou was the voice that reminded her who she really was. "Don't you forget where you came from," Betty Lou would say during their weekly phone calls. "All that fame and money doesn't mean a thing if you lose yourself." Julia never forgot. Even as her career exploded, Pretty Woman, Aaron Brockovich, Oscar nominations and wins. She made time for those phone calls. Every Sunday evening, no matter where she was filming, she'd call her grandmother. They talk about everything. About Julia's kids, about Betty Lou's garden, about the movies, yes, but more often about normal things, family gossip, recipes, the kind of conversations that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with love. In 2012, Betty Lou was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer, stage 4. The prognosis was measured in months, maybe a year if she was lucky. Julia flew home immediately. She sat beside her grandmother's hospital bed and held her hand. The same hand that had braided Julia's hair when she was 6, that had taught her how to bake biscuits, that had applauded at her high school plays before anyone knew her name. "I'm not afraid," Betty said, her voice thin but steady. "I've had a good life. I've seen you become everything I knew you could be. Don't talk like that," Julia said, tears streaming. "You're going to beat this." Betty Lou smiled. That same smile Julia had inherited. "Sweetheart, we both know better. But I need to tell you something important." She explained her plan. She'd been working with a friend recording something, a message. She wouldn't tell Julia what it said, just that it existed. And when the time came, when Julia needed to hear it most, someone would know to play it. "Promise me you won't go looking for it," Betty Lou said. "Promise me you'll let it find you when the time is right." Julia promised, though she didn't understand. Betty Lou died 3 months later. Julia gave a eulogy that barely made it through. She threw herself into work afterward, filming, promoting, staying busy because grief doesn't hurt as much when you're moving. 12 years passed. Julia's career continued to flourish. She had more children. She took on new roles. She lived the life Betty Lou had wanted for her. Successful but grounded, famous but real. But she never found the recording. Never even looked for it. She'd made a promise until tonight. November 2024. The Tonight Show, when Jimmy Fallon's producer had received an email from Betty Lou's executive. A reminder set to send 12 years after her death with an audio file attached and specific instructions about when and how to play it. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The recording continued in the silent studio. Betty Lou's voice preserved perfectly, speaking to her granddaughter across 12 years of absence. I know it's been a long time since you heard my voice. And I really hope that you've been happy, that you found joy, that you've kept being the Julia I knew. Not just the movie star, but the real you. Julia had her face in her hands now, shoulders shaking with sobs. The audience watched in reverent silence. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something sacred. I want you to remember something, sweetheart. Betty Lou's voice said, all those Sundays we talked on the phone. Those were the best part of my week. Not because you were famous. Because you were you, because you still called your old grandmother even when the whole world wanted your time. Jimmy reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a handkerchief. An actual cloth handkerchief. The old-fashioned kind. He stood up from behind his desk, walked around it, and approached Julia's chair. The cameras followed him. The control room was silent. Every producer, every technician understood they were witnessing something that transcended their planned show. Jimmy knelt beside Julia's chair and offered her the handkerchief. She took it with trembling hands, pressing it against her eyes. There's more, Jimmy said softly. Do you want me to stop it? Julia shook her head violently. No, please. I need to hear all of it. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Betty Lou's voice continued. I recorded this 12 years before you'll hear it because I wanted to make sure enough time had passed. Time for you to miss me. Time for you to forget what my voice sounds like. Time for this to mean what it needs to mean. Julia let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I never forgot. She whispered to the recording. I never forgot your voice. I want you to know that every single thing you've done has made me proud. Betty Lou said, every movie, every award, every time you stood up for yourself or for someone else, every time you chose kindness over fame, every time you remembered who you really are. The recording paused for a moment. The static crackled. Then Betty Lou's voice came back softer now, more intimate. But Julia, the thing I'm most proud of, it's not the Oscars or the magazine covers. It's that you kept calling me every Sunday. Even when you were filming in London or promoting in Tokyo or walking red carpets, you called. You remembered. That's the Julia I loved. That's the Julia I want you to always be. Julia was looking at Jimmy now, mascara streaked down her face, the handkerchief clutched in her hand. How did you get this? She asked, her voice raw. Your grandmother's lawyer sent it to us, Jimmy said. With very specific instructions. It was supposed to be played on a talk show on live television. She wanted you to hear it in front of people, she said. She said you needed witnesses. Witnesses to what, to you remembering? Jimmy said simply. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. The recording wasn't finished. Now Julia, Betty Lou's voice said, taking on that tone she used to use when Julia was young and needed to be told something important. I have a request. I'm making it 12 years after I'm gone because I want you to have had time to process my death, to move forward, to live your life. Julia leaned forward, listening intently. I want you to start calling someone else every Sunday. I don't care who. One of your children, your husband, an old friend. Someone who needs to hear your voice the way I needed to hear it. Someone who needs that weekly reminder that they matter to you. Julia's hands covered her mouth again, because that's what those calls did for me, sweetheart. They reminded me every week that I mattered, that even with all your success, all your fame, you still had time for your old grandmother. And I want you to give that gift to someone else now. Pass it forward. Keep that tradition alive. The recording ended with static, then silence. The studio stayed silent for a long moment. 300 people holding their collective breath, watching Julia Roberts process a message from beyond the grave, delivered with perfect timing by a woman who had loved her enough to plan this moment 12 years in advance. Then Julia did something no one expected. She stood up, walked to the edge of the stage, looked out at the audience. "My grandmother," she said, her voice steadier now, though tears still streamed down her face, "believed that the most important thing you could give someone was your time, not your money, not your fame, your actual time." The audience was leaning forward, hanging on every word. "She also believed," Julia continued, "that grief is meant to be shared, that we're not supposed to cry alone, that witnessing each other's pain is how we stay human." She turned back to Jimmy, who was still standing beside the guest chair, his own face wet with tears. "Thank you," Julia said, "for playing that, for letting me fall apart on your show, for understanding that sometimes television needs to be real." Jimmy nodded, unable to speak. Julia reached into her purse, which was sitting beside the guest chair, and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to make a call," she said, "right now on live television, because my grandmother just reminded me what's important." She dialed, put the phone on speaker. It rang twice, then a young woman's voice. "Mom, are you okay? You never called during." "I'm fine, honey," Julia said, smiling through her tears. "I'm on the Tonight Show right now, actually in front of millions of people. And I just heard your great-grandmother's voice for the first time in 12 years. What? I'll explain later. But I called because from now on I'm calling you every Sunday just to talk, just to hear your voice, just because you matter to me and I want you to know it every single week. Is that okay?" There was a pause, then clearly emotional. "Mom, that's yes. Yes. That's more than okay." Julia hung up, looked at the camera. "She told me to pass it forward. So I am." The audience erupted. Standing ovation. Not the polite applause of a talk show, but the thunderous, cathartic applause of people who had just witnessed something profound. Jimmy walked back to his desk and pulled out his blue note cards, the cards he used for every interview. He wrote something on the top card, then handed the entire stack to Julia. "Your grandmother was right about witnesses," he said. "We all just witnessed you making that promise. These cards are yours now. Write down who you're going to call every Sunday. Keep them as a reminder." Julia clutched the cards to her chest. "Thank you, Jimmy, for everything." That night changed late-night television. Jimmy Fallon proved that sometimes the bravest thing a host can do is let real life happen, even when it breaks the format. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Julia kept her promise. Every Sunday, she calls her daughter. She also started a foundation in Betty Lou's name that connects isolated elderly people with weekly phone call volunteers. The handkerchief Jimmy gave Julia that night is framed in her home office. Beside it, the note cards with the names of everyone she calls. And somewhere, Betty Lubres is smiling, knowing her message landed exactly when it needed to.